Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Passport to Peru lecture series. My name is Kiernan, and I will be your host on behalf of Peru for Less and Inca Expert Travel. Today's lecture is focused on Lima's melting pot with our expert, Dr. Javier Puente. I firstly would like to thank everyone tuning in with us tonight on Zoom and Facebook Live. We are so happy that you could join us. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Dr. Puente will be taking questions from the audience after his lecture, so please feel free to send questions for him at any time during the presentation. For those on Facebook, just send in your questions into the comment section of the Facebook Live. And for those on Zoom, just enter in your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom browser. After the event, I would also like you guys to be on the lookout for an email from us with a link to the recorded lecture in case you would like to rewatch it. Today, we are so pleased to welcome back Dr. Puente, an interdisciplinary scholar of Andean environments and politics. Javier is an assistant professor of Latin American studies at Smith College, where he teaches classes about agrarian landscapes and rural environments. Today, Javier will showcase the history of Lima from its pre-Columbian origins through its refoundation as a major Spanish-American outpost. He will also discuss its 20th century dynamics of demographic explosion to its position as one of the world's foremost megalopolis. Javier is the author of more than half a dozen publications, received a PhD from Georgetown University, and has held appointments at Lehigh University, the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, the John Carter Brown Library, and Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Hi, Javier. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Hi, Kiernan. How are you? It's a pleasure to see you again and a pleasure to be with your audience.
Yes, thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here again. Before we get started, I was wondering if you could tell our audience what is something that you do every time you come to Lima?
Eating, of course, and I'm always
Of
craving
course.
a good ceviche, and that's the first thing I intend to do next week when I will be able to travel back to Lima for a little while.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, you have to try ceviche when you're here. It is a delicious dish, and in Lima is the best place to find it, really.
Mm-hmm.
Well, great. Before you get started on your lecture, I do just want to remind everyone again that they can send in questions for you at any time. So we're going to have a Q&A for about 15-20 minutes after the lecture. And so if you have questions, Javier will be happy to answer them. Well, thanks again, Javier, and over to you.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all one more time. I think the last session for this calendar year. I know it's been difficult for all of us, being quarantined and trying to stay safe from the virus. And this has been, I must say, quite a comfortable and soothing experience. Just the opportunity to share some thoughts and some reflections with this fantastic audience. So today I wanted to talk about my hometown. I was born in Lima. I'm a Limeño, and I guess one of the first things I would share with you, I don't know how much of an oversharing this is that every Limeño has a love-hate relationship with Lima. So we loved it, and I was just saying a minute ago that I intend to travel to Lima next week in spite of all restrictions and cautionary warnings, because I miss it. I miss my family, but at the same time, I think the moment we arrive, we start to hate it, and the moment we leave, we start to miss it. And I think that's how most Limeños roll. But I guess. So some of the big takeaway ideas that I want you to think about and to remember about this lecture, quote unquote lecture, is that the existence of Lima precedes the Spanish refoundation of the city. So I think often it's highlighted that Lima is close to have 500 years. It was founded in 1535, so within a few more years, if Peru continues to exist, despite all this political crisis, Lima will be 500 years old, and that's a point. I mean, yes, I think the Spanish version of Lima will be 500 years old, but there were indigenous settlements that preceded the arrival of Spanish conquistadors, and they are as important to understand why Lima was refounded, where it was refounded. And I would say also that it is equally important to understand the future of Lima, as I'll explain in a minute. Lima, yes, it's a Spanish, so that's the first big takeaway idea. The second big takeaway idea is that Lima was refounded by the Spanish. It was a Spanish city, it was a major Spanish city, but it was also a major imperial city. So it was a pivotally important place for the Spanish Empire for at least 300 years. And for better or worse, some of the characteristics that any imperial city has remain in place. The importance of the church, the prone to bureaucratic maneuvers for doing everything. Some of Lima's political conservatism can also be explained through its role as a major imperial capital of the world. Of course, the version that you know of Lima, it's the version that emerged in the 20th century, and that is the third big takeaway idea that I want to share with you. You see now a huge city, a sprawling city too. It's very vast, densely populated, but those dynamics that shape the face of Lima as you currently experience it probably date only as back as the 1940s and the 1950s. And it happened due to a process that not only affected Peru, but affected the world. So around that time, the world became less rural. There were massive internal migrations from countryside to cities. And Lima is in many ways a result of all these internal migrations, as much as it's also the result of international migrations. So migration is an essential human experience that completely reshapes the facade of these megalopolis. And the final big takeaway idea has to do with the multiple challenges that, that Lima has in the future, one of which I think primarily is its sustainability. And that is a question that most cities the size of Lima or bigger will confront in years and decades to come. Is it sustainable to continue to live in these places? Is Lima or is city livelihood sustainable in the eve of climate change, global warming, and all the ecological transformations that we're seeing in the world these days? So let me walk you through these big four ideas. Lima is a desert, and I think the moment you're landing in Lima, you realize what sort of environmental characteristics this city has. It's the third largest desertic city after Cairo, and I cannot remember the other one. I just forgot it, but it's the third largest desert city in the world these days, and it always was a desert. It always was a desert, even since its pre-Columbian times. So pre-Columbian, before the conquest, settlements in what is now Lima had to deal first and foremost with the seemingly arid environment of the Central Pacific coast. And that is a huge achievement. Just as it is absolutely amazing that Lima continues to survive and in many ways to thrive in spite of being a desert. But the first settlers of this coastal desert really mastered a number of interesting things. First, the very scarce precipitation that Lima experienced. Once you live enough in Lima for long enough, you realize that most of the year the sky is gray, but it never rains. And that has to do with the altitude of the Andes and the fact that the moist that comes from the Amazon doesn't move all the way to the coast. It gets trapped in the middle of the Andes. It's just, it never rains, right? There is very, very scarce precipitation. This desert also doesn't have many valleys, many rivers. It's a fairly scarce hydrological basin, the one that bleeds into the Pacific Ocean. There are only a handful of rivers, particularly rivers that can sustain major forms of settlement. And the third major challenge as you try to settle in this region of the country is the occurrence of El Niño Southern Oscillation. El Nino events, these major oceanic oscillation that shift global ecologies around the world still nowadays. And this oscillation has happened for several thousand years at least. So the Ichma, which were probably the most important pre-Columbian civilization that settled in Lima before the Incas and before the Spanish, were masters of hydraulic principles, masters of harnessing water and its hydraulic capacities for making desert livelihood possible. And they did so on the premise of mastering really two river basins, the Rimac River and the Lurin River. And by the way, it is believed that the Rimac River gave its name to the city. So it was Rimac, and then an alliteration happened, and it ultimately became Lima. So Ichma is the major pre-Columbian polity that existed, that we know dominated these valleys at least between 1100 and 1469, right before the arrival of the Inca state. There is a very well-known archaeological site near Lima that actually forms part of some of the tours that Peru for Less offers, known as Pachacamac. It's actually portrayed on this slide. Well, Pachacamac, its original name was actually Ishma. And Ishma was the name of this settlement under the Ichma polity. And something that fascinates travelers, and that fascinates, of course, archaeologists, is the degree of urban development that Pachacamac and Ichma had. It shows that whatever technological advancements the Ichma polity had achieved was not only able to sustain precarious forms of livelihood and precarious settlements and villages, but a genuine urban development that in many ways was unparalleled anywhere in the world, particularly in Europe. It sustained dense populations in the midst of a desert. And it did so on the combination of these hydraulic principles that I was telling you about a minute ago. So mastering river basins, mastering scarce precipitation, of course, venturing into the ocean and establishing a fishing-based economy, but also through transregional trade. So whatever needed to be consumed in these valleys had to come from somewhere else, which is actually what still happens in Lima. Lima, it's a major culinary hub. It's a hot spot. It's a culinary capital of the world. But nothing that is consumed in Lima, it's actually produced in the nearby valleys. It's produced elsewhere in other regions. So that transregional trade has existed for several hundred years. And it was another element that sustained these urban developments. But through this transregional trade is how the Ichma polity ultimately came into contact with the Incas. So what happened when the Incas arrived? Right? The Incas, who had emerged in the valleys of Cusco, the southern central Andes, made their way to the coast as they advanced trade. And once they came into contact with the Ichma polity, and once they, for instance, took over Pachacamac, they changed the name. They changed the name of Ichma to Pachacamac, a deity, an Inca deity that represented the mighty power of the earth and earthquakes. But they allow regional cults to continue insofar as local populations worship Incan deities as well. So Pachacamac really, the way it is preserved, shows the syncretism, the combination of at least two major civilization developments in these areas of pre-Columbian settlement, the Ichma and the Incas. And that's something truly fascinating and something that you can rarely see anywhere else in Peru, I would say. As I said at the beginning, Lima was refounded as a Spanish city, and it was refounded on January 1535 by Francisco Pizarro, the famous conquistador of Peru. Excuse me. Pizarro and his fellow conquistadors were finding a unique place. We're trying to find a unique place. They had actually established a different capital in the middle of the country, in the city of Jauja, nearby contemporary Huancayo, in the central valley of the Mantaro River. It was a very fertile valley. It was ideal for flourishing and prospering as a newly established Spanish settlement. But it didn't have something that Pizarro knew very well, that a potential capital for Spanish possessions would require eventually, and that was access to the ocean. That's something that Lima presented. So Lima, in a way, presented the best of two things that were absolutely treasured for the Spanish Empire: the combination of being a valley and a port. A valley created by the Rimac River, back then much more copious and abundant than what the Rimac River is these days. A river that sustained agrarian foundations for a new city, but also a port that could connect Lima as a new outpost of a Spanish empire that was largely oceanic based. The whole prosperity of the Spanish Empire relied on connecting very distant outposts through transoceanic trade. And that uniqueness of Lima, that uniqueness of these characteristics make Lima the ideal hub for establishing what in the next few months after its foundation would be known as the City of Kings. Actually, Lima's original colonial name was not Lima, was Ciudad de los Reyes, or City of Kings. And there's some confusion about why it was City of the Kings, right? It is believed sometimes that it was referring to the kings of Spain, of the Spanish monarchy. But in reality, it refers to the Reyes Magos, the three wise men. And why is that? Because Pizarro alleged that it was the Bethlehem star that had guided him and his comrades to this particular ideal prosperous valley with a port for the establishment of this new city. Hence the reason why the coat of arms of Lima has three crowns and the Bethlehem star, for the three wise men and the Bethlehem star that guided Pizarro to this unique space. Lima became a viceregal capital. It became the capital of the viceroyalty of Peru. It also became an imperial center. It hosted some of the most prominent institutions of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, including the Real Audiencia de Lima, a major equivalent of a tribunal for delivering justice that was established in 1543. And it was also the city where the Spanish Empire founded the first university in the Americas. Actually older than Harvard University, even though Harvard doesn't want to recognize this, right? The San Marcos University was established in 1541, the first university in the Americas, which again tells you the importance of this new Spanish settlement. It was a city conceived for Spanish people to move there and permanently resettle and live there and prosper there and live for generations to come. Now, colonialism was not a happy tale, as you well know. There was racial segregation, there was caste separations, and that was best represented by the Spanish idea of the two republics. Not republics in the sense of our contemporary use of the term republic. Instead, the idea of like two public spaces, two res públicas. There was a republic for Spanish, a realm for Spanish, and there was a republic for Indios, a realm for Indian or indigenous peoples. In fact, Lima became a walled city, became an encircled city, and indigenous populations that would work in Lima, that would be used for the day-to-day activities of Lima, weren't allowed to live permanently within the confinements of the walled city. they would live in the outskirts, outside the wall. That region outside the walls of Lima became known as the Cercado de Indios. And that is the name that the contemporary district around Lima's downtown still has. That's where I grew up, in the Cercado de Lima. And that name Cercado comes from colonial times, from this space that was inhabited solely by indigenous people. Lima is something that Pizarro didn't know. Lima is located on top of the Nazca Plate. It's a major tectonic area of the world. And as anyone who has spent enough time in Lima knows, Lima is subject to constant earthquakes. There was actually an earthquake just 2 days ago. I think it was not so strong, but long enough to scare my parents. The last strong earthquake that fully destroyed Lima occurred in 1746. It was I think, 7.7 earthquake right in front of Lima that was followed by a major tsunami. And that completely wiped out the colonial Lima that had existed up to that point. So when you go to Lima's downtown these days and you see something that is colonial, most likely it was something that was rebuilt after the 1746 earthquake. Such is the case, for instance, of the facade of the Cathedral of Lima. In this case, I use an iconic image. This is the Church of St. Francis of Assisi. It's nearby the Cathedral of Lima. Actually, this particular facade, the central part of the facade, precedes the 1746 earthquake. And there are some internal parts of the church that also precede the 1746 earthquake. But most of the exterior was rebuilt as anything else, everything else in the aftermath of this big earthquake. Lima, after colonial times, and particularly after a major international war that Peru experienced with Bolivia and Chile in the late 19th century, gradually became a megalopolis. The city was once again devastated, materially devastated by the Chilean invasion of the city. And much of the downtown was once again rebuilt because it was set on fire by foreign invaders. Something unique that happened in the post-war reconstruction of Lima was that policymakers and state makers identified that there was a new unique social class that had emerged within the last few years, clearly identifiable as a working class, as laborers. And it was believed that laborers would need a specific settlement, a specific location for them to settle. And that place became La Victoria, still nowadays a very working class neighborhood. But that was, once again, conceived as such, conceived as a working class settlement. That happened in 1896. The government palace that we currently know was rebuilt after the War of the Pacific. The Avenida Arequipa, the Arequipa Avenue, that connected Lima's downtown with this sort of like, the most modern area of Lima in many ways, the most touristy area of Lima, was also built around 1918, 1919. So this was our early 20th century developments or post-war developments that started to provide Lima with a modern face. Yet the tectonic plates shook Lima's foundations once again. And in 1940, another earthquake, not as massive as the 1746, but strong enough, brought down some critical areas of the city. Some parts of the port of Callao fell apart, and they were never rebuilt. They were never rebuilt, and they remain as slum and precarious settlements until our days. When some urban developers try to explain that endurance of temporary settlements, They say that that's one defining characteristic of Peruvian identity. In Peru, the temporary becomes permanent. Um, and around the earthquake, it's when Peru's massive internal migrations started to occur. Let me give you an example. In between 1940 and 1960, Lima went from having 0.6 million inhabitants to 2 million inhabitants. And that huge demographic explosion happened, yes, because of our own experience of the boomer generation, the baby boomers, but also because these massive internal migrations and the deruralization of the country. The country, Peru, and arguably the world became less rural around this time. There was a classroom experiment that I used to do. I was able to do it both in Lima and in Santiago. I cannot do it in the United States because internal migrations work differently here. And I still actually have to understand how population dynamics of resettlement work here. But that classroom experiment went as follows. Basically, I would ask any classroom to say, raise your hand if you were born in Lima. So I would say that maybe 8 out of 10 students would raise their hands. Maybe 2 would come from other provinces, right? So from those 8, I said, well, remain your hands or keep your hands raised if your parents are from Lima, and then you would get, 4 out of the 8, maybe 5 at most. And then you ask, well, now from those 4 or 5, keep your hands raised if your grandparents are from Lima, and then you rarely get 1. And that tells you the demographic composition of Lima. So Lima is in many ways a city made by smaller chunks of internal migration and people from all over the country. How did that growth happen? It happened in concentrical ways. It happened in gradually new concentrical developments that would add a new circle of precarious settlements initially around a more consolidated core. Those new concentrical developments would sometimes be known as or be labeled as pueblos jóvenes or barriadas, but they were gradually incorporated as years passed by into the core, the official Lima. Something that I want to mention here is that many of the most important material developments of Lima are associated with military dictatorships. So Manuel Odría, a general who was dictator of Peru between 1948 and 1956, is praised as the founding father of unidades vecinales, which is the kind of neighborhood in which I grew up. It's a condominium for the working classes. All right, a complete new urban experiment to create sanitized housing for working classes, both limeños, but also more importantly, newcomers to the city. And General Juan Velasco Alvarado, who was a dictator of Peru between 1968 and 1975, is known for being the founding father of Villa El Salvador, arguably one of the most populous districts of Lima, and a populous district, a thriving, economically thriving district that emerged initially as a precarious illegal settlement sanctioned by Juan Velasco Alvarado. So what does Lima look like these days? I selected, I think, a problematic figure, and maybe some of you have heard this news through the woods, maybe you haven't. But Lima is, it's a place of wonder, but it's also a place of sorrow and a place of some really disgraceful developments. Lima is home to a wall that divides one of the most prosperous districts of the city, Las Casuarinas, with one of the most, if not the poorest district of Lima, Pamplona Alta. They share a hill, but it's a hill that is divided by a wall that intends to contain poverty, intends to deter poor people from entering Las Casuarinas. Peruvians complain about the building of walls elsewhere, but we have one at home. Currently, the city occupies 1 million square miles. It's 43 districts and it has more than 10 million inhabitants. It's the third largest desert city, and that means a major sustainability challenge. Among other reasons, because put quite simply and quite bluntly, there is not enough water for sustaining 10 million people in a desert. That is the one key challenge that the city will confront in years to come, and not in the distant future, but probably within the next few years. It's a city of all bloods, as some anthropologists once labeled Lima. It's the result of internal and international migrations. I mentioned people coming from provinces, the highlands. My grandparents came from Huancavelica and Huamachuco and resettled in Lima. But it's also internal migration. Italians, Japanese, more recently Venezuelans, around I think 400,000 Venezuelans have come to Peru, and many settle in Lima and change positively the demographic facade of the city. Here is a daring proposal, and please take it with a grain of salt. This is my intervention on this subject. But as some of you who might have experienced something related to Peruvian cuisine, we love rice. We absolutely love rice. If there is no rice on the plate, the meal is not complete, right? And rice consumption and rice growth, it's directly related to the arrival of Chinese workers around the mid to late 19th century to replace enslaved labor once slavery was abolished. I think it's estimated that around 200,000 Chinese coolies, laborers, were forcibly brought to Peru. And that also changed the face of the city and the cultures and our habits and our patterns of consumption. So my daring proposal is to, the next time you go to Lima, if you ever go to Lima, to see elements of Chinese culture in the city. And I would say that it is Lima, not San Francisco, which I think sometimes claims this title, the most Chinese city in the Pacific outside China. The one with the heaviest Chinese influence. And like I said, to end this lecture and just open the floor for questions and answers, it's a place of wonder and sorrow. Lima has the finest restaurants in the continent. But those finest restaurants, it would be hypocritical to deny this. They coexist with malnutrition and extreme poverty. And so the challenge ahead for Lima, as much as it's the challenge ahead for Peru and probably for the world, is how to continue growth while promoting equity. So I would leave it at that and just open the floor for conversations, questions, thoughts, anything you would like to share.
Thanks so much for that wonderful lecture, Javier. It was really fascinating to learn about Lima's long history with you. As I would like to remind everyone that you can still submit your questions, so please feel free to do so. The first question we have is from Michael. He would like to know what influences from pre-Columbian Lima can still be recognized in the modern city.
Regrettably, not so many. Lima hasn't cared so much about its pre-Columbian patrimony as other cities in Peru. And there are a few surviving huacas. Huacas are major sites that were also considered deities in most pre-Columbian cultures. There is the Huaca Puquiana, there is the Huaca San Mateo, there is Pachacamac, just outside Lima, but it's only a handful of them. There used to be a huge chunk of the Capacñan, the huge Inca road, that transited throughout Lima, went through San Miguel, well into the ocean, connecting the central Andean region with the Pacific Ocean. And a portion of it still exists inside the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Peru's campus. But even the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Peru destroyed a section of the Capacñan for the sake of building something new. So not even our educated elites care about the pre-Columbian patrimony, and that's sad. So next time you see something that resembles pre-Columbian origins and presents some pre-Columbian heritage, really treasure it, because Lima policymakers just don't care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. The Huacas are some of my favorite parts in Lima to visit. It's really interesting to see how, this, adobe pyramid in the middle of a very modern looking neighborhood. So I definitely recommend for anyone to check those out when they come. Um, Another question we have from Nancy, she would like to know, besides tourism, which sectors of the economy are expected to grow after the pandemic and why?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I think what is expected, particularly in Lima, it's services of multiple sorts, particularly retail-related services. But what kind of growth is that, right? I mean, it represents growth for major corporations, but the labor regimes that really, govern most of Lima's population's participation in that growth is precarious, to say the least, right? What is the minimum wage in Peru these days? I think $350, $400, no more than $400, right? And the moment you start raising questions about this and the idea of just expanding labor rights, they start accusing you of being radical, of being a communist. So it's tourism, yes, it's retail services, and maybe cuisine, maybe the restaurant, but that's included in services. So beyond those two realms of economic activity, I cannot see what else can have a sort of like a huge prompt jumpstart in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think definitely tourism has always been very important in Peru. And, we're all hoping that we'll have a strong comeback after this pandemic and everyone feels safe traveling again. Definitely. Mario says, wonderful lecture, thank you. He lived in Lima during the 80s when the threat of terrorism was constant, and he knows things have changed now. Are you hopeful for the future for Lima with regards to sustainability or for stability and continued economic growth?
Oh, thank you, Mario. Thank you so much. I mean, we need perspective, right? And the fact that you lived there in the 1980s should feed my hope to see that despite the challenges ahead, we'll move forward one way or another, right? These days, for reasons that exceed the topic of this conversation, I think very few Peruvians are hopeful about what's to come within the next few weeks, months, and probably years. Yeah, that said, it's a radically different city, and I have, of course, vivid memories of what Lima looked like in the 1980s. But on the other hand, I mean, what we consider, what we have sometimes even pitched internationally as the Peruvian miracle, this fantastic cosmetic enhancement that the city experienced, has proven to be nothing but cosmetic. Because in the event of this pandemic and the manifold crises that this pandemic has triggered, sanitary, economic, social, political, Lima and the country at large has proven not to have one single institution that was able to resist, to have to offer a minimum of resilience against the challenges presented by this multi-layered crisis. So it's tricky. I mean, if the question is, would we see cosmetic enhancements? Yes, we might. But underneath that cosmetic enhancement, I hope there is substantial change. Let's hope so.
I do as well. Yes, definitely. Let's hope so. I definitely think that like now Peruvians feel very like they're very much paying attention to what's happening around them, and they're not afraid to speak up about it. So I think that will be very important for the growth of Peru in the future. LN would like to know if you could talk a little bit about the water in Lima now, since it started with the hydraulics, but now the lack of it is a threat to the city.
Oh, yes, I can talk about water. Most of the water that Lima consumes comes from the Mantaro Valley, one river that crosses the country along its central Andean region, and is one of the tributaries of the Amazon. Um, Actually, there should be a tour to La Tarjea, which is Lima's main reservoir of water. So you could witness, on the one hand, the achievement of harnessing water from one specific region for the sustenance of 10 million people elsewhere. And that in itself is a huge technological achievement. But on the other hand, it should signal the precariousness of the sustainability of that same people. Because if that water goes away, if something happens to that water, it can really hijack the whole city within days, if not hours. And let me tell you an anecdote that is well known by people who live in Lima. Maybe Mario remembers this. I think it was around 1987, 1988, because I was 5 or 6. Sendero Luminoso, an insurgent group with terrorist practices that practice a sabotage war against the Peruvian state and civil society, decided to bomb Lima's water reservoir. It didn't cause all the water to go away, but it did cause clean water to mix with used water. And so for a few hours, everywhere in Lima, once you open the tap or the shower, you would get dark waters, you get surf waters coming out of the tap. That was one of the days in which Limeños and Limeñas generally thought that Sendero had won, that we were losing that war, and the apocalypse was around the corner. But it again shows you the precariousness of Lima's thin survival on extracting water from a distant region, reserving it and keeping it, and then using it gradually. Of course, that's, we're subject to droughts. We are in the midst of a drought in Peru, which is a narrative that you don't see anywhere besides scientific papers. We don't know what's going to happen with the agrarian campaign this summer. We don't know how much the harvest is going to be next June. We have no idea. We're still concerned about the pandemic, of course, for all the good reasons. But June 2021 can be a really cataclysmic month for Peru and for Lima particularly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope that we do actually, that the yields of the agriculture are, not devastated in the next year. I think, we have had such a tough year globally in 2020. I know we're all looking hopeful to 2021 and, trying to stay as hopeful as possible, but it's definitely important to be realistic about concerns as well. Another question we have is from an anonymous guest, and they would like to know, how do Limeños define themselves? Are there characteristics that all Limeños share? And Limeños are people from Lima.
Yes, oh, that's I think as Limeños or Limeñas, right? Something that that often happens. I mean, that was my experience. You have to keep in mind that I haven't lived in Lima permanently for the last 12 years, right? So I'm sharing with you my experience up to, I guess, 2008. But Lima is it's a peculiar city, right? It's very classist, and it's fairly racist. So Limeños try to define themselves in terms of which district they live in, which high school they attended, particularly upper class Limeños, which university they attend, and a profound sense of belonging to the city. Many Limeños and Limeñas try to obscure its provincial roots, its outside Lima roots, and just embrace a process of whitening. And of course, as it happened elsewhere in the world, Limeños and Limeñas define themselves through what they consume, right? Which restaurants they go to, which malls they shop at, what kind of clothes they use. So it's once again, I'm sorry to be pitching sort of like a too realistic image of Lima, but it's a place of wonder and sorrow at the same time.
Yes, so I think another thing that brings Limeños together and maybe apart is which soccer team they support.
Oh yes, that's a good one. That's a good one. I didn't want to talk. That's a delicate subject these days because a major Lima team has been relegated to the second division. We won't name names, but it has created. I've been told that it has created a major crisis in some Limeño communities. So yes, football is important, absolutely. And I guess so let me say something positive. I think something that all Limeños and Limeñas are proud about is food, right? So regardless of what the situation looks like, what the political crisis looks like, what the economic condition looks like, there's always a good ceviche waiting for you. I mean, look what I said at the beginning of my lecture, right? What do you want to do? Do I want to march? Do I want to protest? No, I want to eat a ceviche. Then I'll protest.
Wonderful, definitely. I think food brings everyone from Lima, and anyone who comes to Lima is definitely something that they will remember. Wonderful. To go back to the water, we did have another question about water, just in case you know any information about this, is if Lima has experimented, or Peru in general has experimented in investing in purifying salt water for support for the city?
It has, but unfortunately it's too expensive. It's still a too expensive process. I was fortunate enough to visit Abu Dhabi in 2018, so I could see firsthand the process of desalinization of seawater, but also the bills that it creates and the subsidies needed for human consumption of desalinized water. And it was part of a mission in which there were Peruvian technocrats that were specialists in desalinization. And I think they all look at it with a maze, like a maze eyes, but at the same time, there is no way we can afford this, right? And not for 10 million people, not for 10 million people. And so, in fact, I think one of the most comprehensive proposals for dealing with the imminent hydraulic crisis of the city is by 2030, so I guess 10 years from now, less than 10 years now, it's ruralizing Lima. It's gradually depopulating Lima. It's trying to move some of these 10 million people outside Lima to the nearby valleys of, in the north, Huacho, Guarmey, Barranca, and in the south to Ica and beyond, because it almost has an expiration date. I think Lima almost has an expiration date, like Cape Town had an expiration date. I think soon we'll have one expiration date. This is the last day in which water will be widely available in Lima, and that's it. And then after that date, that's not to say that Lima people won't be able to access water, but it'll be much more market-based access than it is today. So only people who could be able to afford very high prices of water will access water in Lima.
Thank you for the answer. It's hopefully it won't get to that point, but it's hard to tell. And hopefully as well, like maybe in the future, the purifying salt water will become a less expensive process as well, and eventually Lima would be able to afford it.
That is
another question we have going away from the water. Oh, go ahead.
No. That is definitely one of the hopes that scientists and policymakers have, that desalinization will become less expensive.
Mm-hmm. I share that hope. To move away from water, another question we have is about what sets Lima apart from other capitals in South America.
I think I think it's the one coastal capital, probably with the exception of Buenos Aires. So I'm trying to go through the capitals right now. So Caracas, Buenos Aires, Santiago is not coast, Quito is not coast, Bogota is not coast. So it's a major coastal capital. And there's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. It's a desert city. That's another huge difference. But I think the one feature that Lima has, which is something that actually we shouldn't be proud of, It's how centralistic Lima is. If you go nearly to any other country in South America or in Latin America, there is more than one city that holds major state institutions, except Lima, right? Lima has all the institutions of a central government, all of them concentrated in just one city. And that creates dynamics of centralization that are detrimental to the interests of the nation. And that's something that it's easily fixable, It doesn't require that much to decentralize Lima. So I think those are the characteristics that set Lima apart. Primarily its centralization, how much of a one single epicenter of a country Lima is.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that also affects its population as well, and why so many people are centralized here.
Absolutely. I mean, the next biggest populated city, I think it's Arequipa, and has less than 1 million people, right? So you go from 10 million to less than 1 million, and that's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Arequipa is also really nice. I must say,
city.
It's a beautiful city.
Beautiful city. We should do a session on Arequipa.
I agree. That would be wonderful. Well, we just have a few more questions before we close up for the evening. They're kind of lighter in a topic. One of our guests would like to know what your favorite part of Lima is, except I guess maybe besides the food, and why.
Well, I am a nostalgic person, so I crave my neighborhood, right? The Unidad Vecinal de Mirones. That's where I grew up, and I treasure it. I mean, I don't think it's a touristy area. But if you want to, travel to Lima and enjoy some parts that I also enjoy, I think Barranco would stand out. It's a bohemian park right next to Miraflores, not as crowded. And I think it's much more for locals than for travelers. And if you're seeking just for that local bohemian taste, I would say Barranco. Sort of like a ham sandwich in El Juanito, and a chilcano, or a pisco sour, and then a walk around the Malecon. That's a perfect evening for me.
I completely agree. Barranco is one of my favorite neighborhoods, and it definitely has a very relaxed, like easygoing atmosphere to it. Lots of art and good people as well. Well, our last question is, where do you go for the best ceviche in Lima?
Oh my God! I wish I could get a sponsorship for saying this. So if it's a safe move, go to La Mar. Right, Gaston Acurio's famous cevicheria. They don't only offer an excellent ceviche of the pesca del dia, the sort of like fish that just was caught that day, which is a sustainable model, a sustainable culinary model. Try to stay away from cevicherias that just offer one type of fish, because that normally means the depletion of that species. So a good cevicheria should offer a different fish every day, because you don't know what's going to be caught that particular morning. And that's something that that La Mar does, and Gaston Acurio practices widely. Let me see. Well, there is one place that actually the director and founder of Peru for Less, I brought him there, and he's quite the foodie, and he still like it. It's in La Punta in Callao, and it's called La Cabaña de Maguila. And it's a unique ceviche that it's served with milk. I know it sounds gross, but it's not. And he also prepares a ceviche de mango, like a mango ceviche, which is a unique thing that you need to try at one point. So those will be my recommendations. If you are daring La Cabaña de Maguila, safe bet La Mar by Gaston Acurio. I'm going to get my royalties.
I'm taking notes.
I'm going to get my royalties from Gaston Acurio later.
Definitely. Hopefully he'll give you a free ceviche for this.
At least.
Well, you actually had one more question roll in, so I figure I will go ahead and ask it. They would like to know, can you tell us about the culture after eating? Do we listen to music?
No, we chat. So eating in Peru is a social thing. That's a huge difference to the way, at least I experience eating here in the United States. Eating here is something procedimental. It's a procedure, right? Just get fed, and you move on with your day. So eating in Peru is tremendously social. Everything happens over eating. Everything from establishing new relationships, friendly or romantic, to political arrangements. So we just negotiate things over food. And after eating, that means a long sobremesa, a long conversation about whatever you need to discuss. Hopefully joined by a few drinks and a few piscos. So any time a Peruvian asks you for lunch or dinner, it's at least a 4 hour process, right? It's 3 to 4 hour date.
I can
So
attest to this.
yes, we value eating time.
Definitely. And it's a great way too, if you're traveling to Peru and you want to learn more about it and you happen to meet a Peruvian, invite them out to eat. It's a great way to get to know a local person and to really enhance your experience in Peru.
Absolutely.
Well, wonderful. That's about all the time we have, Javier, but thank you again so much for taking the time to answer some questions from the audience and for sharing your knowledge about Lima. It was really fascinating learning about the city that I also call home with you. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you to all the audience. And happy holidays.
Wonderful. Oh, yes, happy holidays, everyone. This is going to be our last lecture before the holiday season, but Javier will be back with a few other special guests in the new year, so be on the lookout for announcements for that. I would also like to thank Peru for Less and Inca Expert Travel for hosting this great event tonight. You can find more about the kinds of trips that they offer to Peru on their websites at either peruforless.com or incaexpert.com. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.